Upon the gray dawn of June 6, 1944, the English Channel unveiled a sight that defied history. A city of steel upon the waves, the greatest armada ever assembled. 7,000 vessels surged across the churning sea, carrying 130,000 men toward a hostile shore. Above them, a sky filled with 20,000 aircraft provided a shield of roaring engines. At first light, following a deluge of naval fire, these men would storm the coast of occupied France. Another 20,000 would descend from the sky. On this single brutal day, 10,500 Allied soldiers would fall. They would be met in death by nearly as many Germans. 11 weeks later, Paris would be free, and the road to Berlin laid bare. But this day of reckoning was born not in the fire of battle, but in the quiet calculus of power, months earlier. December 1st, 1943, the Tehran Conference. 3 men, the arbiters of the free world, had made a decision that would seal the fate of millions. At the top of the steps, Joseph Stalin, the implacable leader of the Soviet Union. Below, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain, burdened by the weight of a promise he dreaded to keep. For 2 years, these men, along with the American President Franklin Roosevelt, had wrestled with the question of a second front in Western Europe. Since Germany's invasion of his country in 1941, Stalin had relentlessly demanded it, a desperate plea to relieve the unimaginable pressure on his armies, then fighting almost alone against Hitler's war machine. Churchill, fearing the catastrophic bloodshed of a frontal assault on Fortress Europe, had persuaded his allies to pursue a different path, a campaign through North Africa to strike at what he called the soft underbelly of the Axis in Italy. But the advance had stalled near Naples, a grinding, bloody stalemate far from the heart of Germany. Roosevelt, long hesitant, now believed his nation was ready. He sought a swift, decisive end to the Third Reich and saw cooperation with the Soviets as the foundation for a post-war world. Churchill, his strategy exhausted, could only acquiesce. The decision was made. Across the Channel, Adolf Hitler had long feared this moment. Since 1942, he had ordered the construction of a monumental defense, the Atlantic Wall. It was a concrete serpent stretching nearly 4,000 miles, a continuous line of fortifications from the northern reaches of Norway to the Spanish frontier. An invasion was no longer a question of if, but when. And against this shield of iron and concrete, a sword was being forged. The fate of the century would be decided by which would break first. The German High Command was convinced the blow would fall at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel, a mere 25 miles from the British coast. To meet this anticipated onslaught, a concrete leviathan was rising from the sands, 13 million tons of it, mixed with the despair of a conscripted army, free laborers, Frenchmen forced into service, refugees, Jews, and prisoners of war, all bent to the task of sealing Fortress Europe. As the year 1943 bled into history, the continent seemed locked in the Reich's iron grip. But in London, the gears of liberation were turning. On the 15th of January 1944, the man handpicked by Roosevelt arrived to take command. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, tasked with planning Operation Overlord, understood the stakes were nothing less than the fate of the world. The stage, he knew, was being set for what he called the beginning of the great and crucial test, a moment to prove that an aroused democracy is the most formidable fighting machine that can be devised. Days later, the architecture of that machine was revealed. As the American Supreme Commander, Eisenhower required a British deputy. He found him in General Bernard Montgomery, the celebrated Monty, hero of the desert campaign against Rommel and an icon to his countrymen. Before the world's press, they presented a united front, gesturing towards a deliberately faded, illegible map. It was a carefully staged performance, a piece of theater designed for an audience of one, German intelligence. While Montgomery, ever the showman, played to the lenses, the true plan remained buried, a secret of monumental consequence. For the real target was not Calais, it was Normandy. Though a longer, more perilous crossing from Britain, its beaches were less fortified, its defenses less formidable. The initial plan targeted a narrow front between Ouistreham and Carentan, but Montgomery, ever ambitious, argued for more. He pushed to widen the assault, to seize the city of Caen and avoid being trapped on the coast. He insisted they extend west, towards the deep water port of Cherbourg, a vital artery needed to supply the Immer. Success hinged on a single, fragile element: surprise. The Germans had to remain blind to the true objective. Eisenhower's arrival in London, however, had not gone unnoticed. It confirmed Hitler's deepest fears of an invasion from the west. In response, he turned to his most brilliant general. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox, was dispatched to the coast, tasked with inspecting and perfecting the defenses of the Atlantic Wall. Two great wills now stood in opposition. One, planning the most complex amphibious assault in history, shrouded in secrecy and grand deception. The other, a master of defense, racing against time to harden a coastline of 1,000 miles. The battle was not yet one of fire and steel, but of shadows and whispers, of feints and intelligence. On this vast continental chessboard, the final pieces were being moved into place, each one carrying the weight of a world on the brink. He was the Desert Fox, the commander whose Africa Corps had bedeviled the British across the sands of North Africa. His legend preceded him. It was only natural then that the Führer would entrust this master of maneuver with the defense of Fortress Europe. By early 1944, Field Marshal Rommel was in France. He found the Atlantic Wall to be a myth. With the Luftwaffe pulled back to defend the German heartland from Allied bombers, he was denied air cover over Normandy. The coming battle would be fought on the ground, on beaches he deemed perilously undefended. His vision was absolute: to forge a continuous line of steel and concrete between the fortified towns, to sow the coastal waters so thickly with mines that they would become a garden of death. But even for a man of Rommel's energy, the scale was staggering. One mine is a mere drop in the ocean when faced with a coastline that stretches 750 miles from Calais to the tip of Brittany. Across the Channel, this flurry of activity was of little concern to the Allied Supreme Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower. For months, a secret of monumental proportions had been taking shape In the ports of Britain, the Allies were building their own harbors. Colossal concrete caissons, code-named Phoenixes, were being constructed, destined to be towed across the sea and sunk, forming the breakwaters of an instant port. Floating docks would rise and fall with the tide, connected to the shore by immense steel pontoons. It was a war-winning feat of engineering, a gigantic construction set that granted the Allies the ultimate freedom, the ability to land anywhere without the need to immediately seize a heavily defended port. In Britain, the rehearsals for invasion continued relentlessly. Every available means was employed. Specialist tanks, equipped with flails, were tested to clear a path through the minefields. Great rolls of matting were designed to help vehicles traverse the soft sand. On artificially undulating roads, drivers accustomed their hands to the feel of new American Jeeps. And then there were the Churchill crocodiles, flame-throwing tanks, dragons of steel designed to incinerate any position that survived the initial bombardment. The training was brutal. Hundreds of men had already been lost in exercises, a grim foreshadowing of the price to come. In the deepest corners of Cornwall, the battle-hardened 4th Commander Brigade was pushed to its limits, forced to confront every conceivable topographical challenge. The Allied doctrine was one of overwhelming force, of entering the fray only when the balance of power was tipped decisively in their favor. And for the men who would have to execute this plan, the farm boys and city dwellers from Utah, Kansas, Ohio, and Kentucky, how many could truly comprehend the immensity of the task that awaited them? They were the small human cogs in a vast and terrible machine about to be set loose upon a shore that would forever be etched into the memory of the world. In the winter of 1944, the British Isles had become a vast waiting garrison. For the 600,000 American servicemen already on its shores, with countless more arriving by the day, this was a world away from home. Few could truly grasp what lay in store across the narrow channel on the beaches of a place called Normandy. The first contact was often one of simple, incongruous sweetness. A donut offered by a British servicewoman, a taste of an America left behind, a small comfort before the storm. But this was merely the vanguard of a much larger offering. The material might of a continent was being unloaded onto Britain's docks. The Sherman tank, designed as the answer to the fearsome German panzers, rumbled through ancient country lanes, and in the skies above the gray stoic towns of England, pub-goers would look up to see the unfamiliar silhouette of the P-38 bomber, a machine whose flying range far outclassed that of its British counterparts. This friendly invasion was not without its cost. To house the arriving legions, entire villages were requisitioned, families compelled to leave homes their ancestors had known for generations. A quiet, simmering friction grew. Stereotypes hardened between the ration-weary Briton and his well-fed American cousin, whose supplies seemed a world of impossible luxury. Yet, amid the tension, new bonds were forged, wryly forgotten. Young American servicemen, on leave from the rigors of training, discovered a world of dance halls and eager partners. For many local women, whose own husbands and sweethearts were fighting far away, it was a fleeting moment of life and vitality. The consequences were profound. Never in the history of the realm had so many marriages dissolved. Never had so many children been born outside of wedlock. It was a social earthquake, shaking the very foundations of a traditional society. But there was more to this alliance than jiving and romance. Its success would depend on leadership. In March, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, traveled to the prestigious Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, the same institution that had shaped a young Winston Churchill. He had come to impress upon a new generation of British officers the brutal truth of what would be asked of them. He spoke not of grand strategy, but of intimate responsibility. "You young men have this war to win," he declared, his voice resonating with a fatherly gravity. "It is up to you to give your units leadership every hour of the day, every day of the week. You must know every single one of your men. You must be their leader, their father, their mentor." Addressing these young men, most in their early 20s, he knew he was speaking to the condemned. He saw before him the future casualties of a necessary sacrifice, the leaders who would have to inspire others to walk into fire. They were the inheritors of a nation that had stood alone for 4 proud years, a nation that had refused to yield. Now, their duty was not to stand, but to advance. For in the crucible of command, a leader is not merely the best soldier. He is the keeper of hope, the shepherd of souls, the one who must carry the weight of all the lives that will be spent to purchase a final costly victory. In the spring of 1944, with the hour of invasion drawing ever closer, Prime Minister Winston Churchill arrived to witness a full-scale exercise. Before him, an American paratrooper unit rehearsed its deadly ballet under the watchful eye of General Eisenhower himself. British newsreels captured the spectacle with unprecedented intimacy, mounting cameras directly on the aircraft. The footage was startlingly real. Were it not for the iconic cigar, one might mistake the Prime Minister for a combatant. He even carried his own camera, a smile betraying his confidence. This very film would later be used by documentarians to depict the first American landings in Normandy, an event for which no actual combat footage exists. But beyond the celluloid record, a more crucial development had taken place. Any lingering doubts Churchill held about Operation Overlord had vanished. He was now utterly committed. As Allied unity solidified in Britain, a starkly different picture emerged within the German High Command. Adolf Hitler remained sequestered in his eastern headquarters, far from the Western theater. His strategy was one of division. Command in the West was fractured, split between 2 formidable but conflicting figures: Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the Supreme Commander, and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with fortifying the coast. Their philosophies on how to repel the inevitable invasion were fundamentally opposed. Von Rundstedt argued for holding the elite panzer divisions in reserve deep inland, ready to converge on the Allied beachhead once its location was certain. Rommel, scarred by his experience in North Africa, countered that Allied air supremacy would render such movements impossible. He believed German armor would be annihilated before it ever reached the battle. The only chance, he insisted, was to meet the enemy at the water's edge, to position the tanks directly behind the beaches and destroy the invasion in its infancy. Rommel's pleas were denied. Denied his mobile armored fist, he poured his formidable energy into static defense. He would make the beaches themselves a death trap. A lethal forest of steel obstacles grew along the shoreline, anti-tank structures and anti-landing craft barrages designed to impale vessels at high tide. Jagged chevaux de frise, forged from old railway tracks, were embedded in the sand to tear open the hulls of advancing vehicles, making any advance almost impossible. Where geography allowed, he turned the landscape itself into a weapon, deliberately flooding the low-lying fields behind the dunes to drown paratroopers and bog down any machine that made it ashore. Meanwhile, on the coast of Devon in southwest England, the rehearsals for this deadly theater continued. American infantry practiced storming beaches eerily similar to those in Normandy. The drills were relentless, the objectives absolute. First, establish a foothold under the cliffs, a tenuous sanctuary from which to set up a radio leroing into the shingle for any scrap of cover. They learned to wait, to seize the fleeting moment between bursts of fire, to retrieve vital equipment, to reach a fallen comrade. But these were only rehearsals. They could not truly simulate the chaos of a beach slick with pebbles where a shovel finds no purchase. They could not replicate the agonizing choice presented by a low tide, forcing a soldier to remain pinned down, meters away from the wounded, their cries lost in the symphony of war. For all the planning, all the drills, the ultimate question remained unanswered, waiting for the dawn on a hostile shore. How does a man function when the script runs out and all that is left is the terrifying improvisation of survival? On the quiet shores of Devon, a dress rehearsal for hell was underway. This beach, a near-perfect double for a stretch of French coastline codenamed Omaha, would soon be seared into history. There, on the far side of the channel, 3,000 American men would fall. This haunting similarity was no accident. The Allies were not invading blind. They knew precisely what awaited them, because for weeks, a torrent of intelligence had flowed from occupied France. Sourced at immense risk by the French resistance, thousands of photographs laid the German defenses bare. The entire Channel coast, whether fortified or not, had been studied with a forensic eye. Every gun emplacement, every obstacle, every trench was spotted, noted, and integrated into a plan of attack of staggering complexity. It was a plan shrouded in the deepest secrecy, and yet, for the enemy, information was plentiful, tons of it, all of it false. For months, Allied counterintelligence had been conducting a masterclass in deception, spoon-feeding the German high command a diet of lies. They painted a picture of an invasion aimed not at Normandy, but at the Pas de Calais, the shortest route across the sea. In Britain, the Phantom Army took shape. Across from the Calais coastline, phony airfields materialized overnight, their runways lined with fleets of inflatable aircraft. A ghost force designed to fix the enemy's gaze in the wrong direction. Meanwhile, in the south of England, the real invasion force gathered, an immense concentration of men and machinery meticulously camouflaged. Supplies, arms, and munitions vanished beneath nets and into forests, hidden from the sky. By the month of May, the sheer scale of the deployment could no longer be concealed. Hundreds of thousands of men were marshaled into sealed camps, moved closer to their embarkation points. They were isolated from the local population, every measure taken to prevent a final fatal leak. Yet, within these compounds, A strange atmosphere prevailed. Officers, sensing the fragility of their men's morale, eased the usual rigidities of military life. At one Royal Air Force squadron, pilots were allowed to keep their long hair, a small act of defiance, before they flew to clip the wings of the German eagle over the fields of Normandy. Among these legions moved figures who would remain forever unseen, the men who filmed the events. They were students of the British Army Film School, all volunteers entrusted with capturing this moment for posterity. The youngest was a 20-year-old named Desmond O'Neill. He was determined to deal rank, to move among the men, to be one of them. "My camera was welcome," he would later recall. "It distracted them." On the 27th of May, his fellow soldiers were introduced to a new currency, French francs, printed not in Paris, but in Washington and London. The move infuriated General Charles de Gaulle, who saw it as a profound violation of French sovereignty. Only France, he argued, had the right to mint its money. But de Gaulle was kept out of the loop, a leader in exile, largely unaware of the specifics being planned for his nation's liberation. For the men in the camps, such high politics were a world away. They were consumed by a more immediate reality. They were facing their own mortality, and it created a unique bond, a quiet intensity. "These men knew they had a good chance of being killed," O'Neill observed, and that created a strange mood. It was the calm of men who had accepted their role in the great, terrible machinery of history, a silence heavy with the knowledge of all that was to come, and all that might be lost. Among them, a 27-year-old Army cameraman, Sergeant Ian Grant. A distinctive Scottish beret, his constant companion, he had joined the Film Corps not merely to escape the drudgery of camp life, but to cast his brothers in arms in the light of immortality. On the 31st of May, his lens captured the moment the abstract became real. He filmed men receiving the booklets that would finally end the speculation, informing them of the war to come and of the country they would soon invade. "It was in that camp," he would later recall, "that we first found our target was Normandy." His camera also recorded the small comforts, the few extra rations distributed to men steeling themselves for the unimaginable. The time for waiting was over. It was now a matter of days. On the 1st of June, another cameraman, Norman Clegg, of whom tragically only a single clapperboard survives, documented the final instructions delivered to his company. He filmed from a high angle, a perspective of detached observation, as if already practicing the art of taking risks. But the unusual vantage point served a more practical purpose: to conceal the location from prying eyes, a secret so deep that even the soldiers themselves had little idea where they were. For 2 weeks, they had been held in perfect isolation. Now, the cards were dealt. For Clegg, for Grant, the start of the great adventure. The American military machine was a thing of awesome scale. With 1.5 million men stationed in the south of England, their numbers now eclipsed those of their British counterparts. In the first days of June, this tide of humanity began to move, pouring out of their camps as locals gathered to bid farewell to their new heroes. All were converging on 19 designated embarkation points along the southern coast. A meticulous geography of war was unfolding. British and Commonwealth troops embarking in the east, American GIs in the west. The next time their boots touched solid ground, it would be on hostile soil. The Canadians, operating under British command, constituted the third largest Allied contingent, providing 21,000 men for the assault. The logistics were a battle in themselves. 20,000 vehicles had to be painstakingly reversed into the holds of landing ships, a remarkable feat of reverse choreography designed to allow them to drive straight onto the beaches. Thousands upon thousands of tons of supplies had to be loaded, enough to sustain the initial onslaught for the first 2 days. To give his plan every chance of success, the Supreme Commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower, had woven his strategy around a delicate celestial alignment. He required the cover of night, but a night illuminated by a full moon for maximum visibility. He needed the landings to occur at dawn on a half tide. In the month of June, the calendar offered only a narrow window, the 5th, the 6th, or the 7th. To achieve the crucial element of surprise, the earlier the better. Ike made his decision. The landings would commence on June the 5th. But the one variable no general could command was the sky itself. As the 5th of June approached, the weather turned. On the 4th, as the vast armadas based in the north of England began to carve their path toward the Channel, a violent tempest erupted. The sea, their bridge to the continent, churned into a gray fury. Eisenhower was forced to issue the one order he dreaded, to recall the fleets already on their way. The greatest invasion force ever assembled was now held in abeyance, its power checked not by an enemy army, but by the indifferent rage of the ocean. For a fleeting, agonizing moment, the fate of the free world rested not on strategy or steel, but on the shifting patterns of the wind. The greatest amphibious invasion ever conceived teetered on the precipice of failure. Every movement, every whispered plan risked alerting an enemy waiting across the water. The specter of discovery haunted the Allied High Command. Through sleepless nights and anxious days, General Eisenhower and his team were bound to their headquarters, instruments of a war machine held in check by an unconquerable foe, the weather. The news from the meteorologists was grim. A forecast of violent storms stretched across the next fortnight, a window of time critical for the invasion's success. Delay meant more than just waiting. It meant a catastrophic loss of momentum, the need to remotivate hundreds of thousands of men, and a shortening of the entire summer campaign by 2 crucial weeks. In the crowded ports of southern England, the tension became a physical presence. Landing craft, packed with soldiers, were forced to circle endlessly in as an agony of suspense. On the 4th of June, among his comrades of the British 3rd Division, Desmond O'Neill felt the lash of a wind that refused to yield. The reality of war for now was one of profound anticlimax. "We just sat there on board," he recalled, "with nothing to do other than eat. A mood of bitter disappointment came over us. We still didn't know where we were going, other than that we were about to cross the Channel. Later, we were told we'd be landing at a place called Lyon-sur-Mer. It didn't mean a thing to any of us." Elsewhere, men sought solace in different ways. The Canadians, many new to the south of England, were known for their devout faith. Never had religious services been so keenly attended as on that wind-swept Sunday. In the face of the unknown, They prayed for the divine help they knew they would soon desperately need. The Americans, by contrast, were driven by a different doctrine. Their commanders knew a bitter truth: nothing erodes come vulnerable. And so they were kept busy, a forced distraction from the immensity of what lay ahead. Then, on the evening of June the 4th, a fragile sliver of hope. The forecast shifted ever so slightly. A period of calmer seas was now predicted for the 5th and 6th. In the span of 30 minutes that night, Dwight Eisenhower made a decision that would alter the course of the 20th century. The fleet would sail. The invasion was on for June the 6th, 1944. On June the 5th, the colossal gears of the machine began to turn. Allied aircraft were unleashed upon northern and western France, a steel curtain intended to sever Normandy from German reinforcements. The bombing was brutal, indiscriminate. For 3 full days, Allied bombers pounded Lower Normandy, claiming almost 4,000 lives, German and French, soldier and civilian alike. The raids ignited heated debate between Eisenhower and Winston Churchill. The Prime Minister was tormented by the thought of French civilian casualties, fearing the weight of hatred that would be left in the wake of their liberation. But from the shadows, the French resistance delivered a chillingly pragmatic reply. This is war. We must accept that people will die. As the military drama reached its crescendo, a political one was unfolding in Algiers. On June the 3rd, General Charles de Gaulle, who had been deliberately kept in silence by his allies, declared the formation of a provisional government for the French Republic. The British and Americans had concealed everything from him, distrusting his ambition. But with the liberation of his homeland imminent, he would not be sidelined. The hour was approaching, an intricate, violent tapestry woven from strategic gambles, political maneuvering, and the quiet endurance of millions for liberation to be born. A terrible price, measured in blood and steel, had first to be paid. For the liberation of France to be absolute, the Allies required the full cooperation of its people and its clandestine resistance. This meant securing the blessing of one man, Charles de Gaulle. Summoned by Churchill a month prior, de Gaulle arrived in Britain not as a supplicant, but as the embodiment of a sovereign nation. He refused to allow the Allies to dictate the terms of his country's freedom. And though they, in turn, refused to entrust him with supreme command, the notoriously sensitive general gave his assent. The invasion would have its French sanction. On the 5th of June, a ghost fleet put to sea. Dozens of small ships steamed north of Le Havre, their funnels billowing a spectral fog. It was a grand deception, a smokescreen of steam and metal foil designed to convince German radar that a vast armada was crossing the channel, aimed far from the true target, the beaches of Normandy. General Dwight D. Eisenhower held a core belief: a leader's place is alongside his men in the final moments before battle. Late that afternoon, at Greenham Common Airfield, he walked among the paratroopers of the United States 101st Airborne Division. Within hours, they would be the first to touch French soil. The Supreme Commander's smiling face was a mask, concealing a tension that coiled in the pit of his stomach. All the more reason for the young men before him, faces painted for war, to put on a brave face of their own, as if to reassure their leader. Eisenhower remained until the end, a solitary figure watching as the last aircraft lumbered into the darkening sky. Elsewhere, without a general to bid them farewell, reconnaissance paratroopers found their own rituals. Some turned to ancient symbols of war, whether a true echo of Iroquois heritage or a white man's myth of the Native American warrior. The scarlet paint was a mask for boys barely in their 20s, preparing for the unimaginable. Those without paint simply blackened their faces with charcoal, hoping to melt into the night. They were burdened with weapons, parachutes, and heavy radio transmitters to signal the drop zones for the paratrooper aboard an aircraft. Each one of them was a walking arsenal, a fragile vessel carrying a 50% chance of survival, a statistic they all knew. That same night, Eisenhower committed to paper the words no commander ever wishes to write, a letter to be opened should the landings end in disaster. It was proof that, for all the planning, the Allies were certain of nothing. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. But this was no desperate gamble. For weeks, a meticulous plan had been perfected. During the night, German coastal defenses would be erased by waves of bombers. At dawn, from 45 miles offshore, the naval artillery would begin its thunderous chorus. The British and Canadians would take the right flank of the invasion, assigned to 3 beaches, Sword, Juno, and Gold. The Americans would assault the left at 2 beaches, codenamed Omaha and Utah. The first crucial objective for the British, the capture of the city of Caen. The plan was a masterpiece of logistics and strategy, a vast and intricate machine of war. But on the eve of the longest day, all that separated victory from catastrophe was the courage of individual men and the lonely resolve of one who had already accepted all the blame. Daybreak on the morning of June the 6th revealed a landscape of immense strategic value. This was the gateway to Cherbourg, a vital port through which the German war machine could funnel reinforcements. But it was also a flat, open country, land that would allow Allied armored divisions to spread out, and for fleets of aircraft to land on makeshift airfields carved from the French soil. The American objective was clear: seize Cherbourg within a week. The port was the key, the deep water harbor necessary to land the hundreds of thousands of men and the mountains of material required for the great offensive to come. At dawn, they were ready. Their target was the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's vaunted coastal fortress. The first test would come here at a stretch of sand near the Cottonton Peninsula, code-named Omaha Beach. The plan demanded they establish a beachhead with brutal speed, link up with their comrades landing at Utah, and then, as one formidable force, drive north toward Cherbourg. But the symphony of war is rarely played as written. Arriving too soon or too late, many of the aerial bombardments had missed their targets entirely. The precise timing of the landings, dictated by the unforgiving tide, had not allowed the bombers enough time to pulverize the German defenses. The main weight of the attack fell to the experienced GIs of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. But attached to them was the 116th Infantry Regiment, a unit that had never seen the line of fire. To stay beyond the range of enemy guns, the landing craft were released into a rough sea far from the coast. Inside, men with a photographer to document the first approach readied his camera. As the ramps dropped, they were met not by a shattered defense, but by an almost intact German killing ground. It was a turkey shoot. The wind drove the tide in faster than forecast. The following waves of men floundered on Rommel's sea defenses, a forest of submerged obstacles that forced them to abandon their craft in deep water. Weighed down by their equipment, many never reached the shore. The sea began to turn red. Unable to advance, the survivors grouped together, pinned down in the center of the beach. They were reduced to sending the same terrifyingly precise message. They were nailed to the spot by enemy artillery. Crucified on the sand, a moment of agony captured in the few remaining blurred photographs by Kappa. The rest of his film was accidentally destroyed in a London darkroom. As strong currents swept landing craft off course, the U.S. command considered the unthinkable, calling off the offensive, abandoning those already ashore to their fate. Hundreds were already dead or wounded. To stop now would open a huge breach in the Allied front. Their sacrifice would have been for nothing. The place would forever be known as Bloody Omaha, and on that sliver of coastline, amid the chaos and the carnage, the fate of the war hung suspended, balanced not on grand strategy, but on the courage of men who had nothing left to do but push forward or die. An armada of 7,000 vessels carves its path through the gray waters, a steel forest closing in on the Normandy coast. And watching over it all, the voice of Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. At 9:45 in the morning, his words reached the world via the BBC, a promise etched into the airwaves. The faith staunch, our arms are resolute. Together, we shall achieve victory. Across a 45-mile front, the scale is almost incomprehensible. Scarcely 250 meters of sea separates one vessel from the next. Above, a sky choked with 11,000 aircraft, each bearing white stripes painted on their wings and fuselage, a stark, simple code to distinguish friend from foe. This overwhelming force was not met with uniform resistance. The German High Command, blinded by a masterful campaign of Allied disinformation, still had its eyes fixed on Calais, convinced this was merely a diversion. As they scrambled to regroup, the much-vaunted Atlantic Wall, that unbreakable barrier of concrete and steel, began to fracture. German anti-aircraft positions were swamped, silenced. Allied aviation owned the sky, flying 10,000 sorties in a single day. As the last bombs from the B-26s fell deep inland, the fighter planes descended. They strafed not only coastal defenses but airfields, pinning what remained of the Luftwaffe to the ground. Communication hubs, roads, bridges, railways, the arteries of the German war machine, were systematically severed. On the ground, the French resistance, its work of intelligence and sabotage complete, now rose in open attack, a shadow army striking from within, determined to stall German reinforcements. The combined pressure meant that divisions summoned from Brittany and the south of the Loire found their advance slowed to a crawl. Erwin Rommel, who had argued for positioning his men close to the beaches, was being proven tragically right. Among the waves, the British 3rd Infantry Division heads for a stretch of sand codenamed Sword. The objective? Neutralize the guns at Ouistreham and seize the city of Caen by nightfall. Within this division are the Scotsmen of the 45th Commando, Royal Marines. With them is Sergeant Ian Grant, and through his lens, history is being recorded. He is the only cameraman to film this attack. "This was the real thing," he would later write. "I filmed the gigantic fleet as best I could, as I was more or less at sea level. We'd been given good rations and even seasickness pills. But with the diesel fumes, most men, even the strongest amongst us, got sick." The sky was, in his words, black with planes. Some were ordered to fly low, their silhouettes announced over loudspeakers so the men could tell them apart from the enemy. We told the men to ignore the cameras as much as possible. They were natural actors deep in their thoughts, living their own experiences. I wasn't afraid, because there was no fear on their faces, just the desire to get out of that bloody boat that was making them seasick. The closer they drew to the shore, the more the world dissolved into a deafening roar. In the final, frantic rush to disembark, a ramp gives way, breaking under the strain. In the grand calculus of war, with its vast fleets and sweeping strategies, the entire enterprise can pivot on such moments. For the men poised at the edge, the line between history and oblivion is often no thicker than a single piece of fractured steel. A desperate convergence on the last remaining gangplank. The only imperative was to get off, to escape the steel death trap, even as the weight of a backpack pulled a man toward the churning sea. For the cameraman Grant and the others with him, the first assault was a horror they were spared. Their trial was yet to begin, a perilous journey to join the paratroopers already scattered deep behind enemy lines. On Sword Beach, another lens was already capturing the chaos. Sergeant O'Neill, the youngest of them, had arrived only minutes before Grant. It was his camera that would film the battle's final harrowing moments. In the thick of the gray smoke, everything seemed spectral, unreal. This was not a battle from imagination, nor one that could ever be truly captured in a film. The exits from the beach were choked, a near impenetrable bottleneck of men and machinery. O'Neill followed an infantry platoon, desperately seeking a way through the maelstrom. And at this precise moment, the lens lurches violently, the camera's silent scream as its operator is struck. He had just enough time, just enough strength to film his last few sequences before being repatriated for care. He was one of the fortunate. For so many of his comrades, there was no journey home. 600 dead and wounded, lost to the great mass of the unknown, most of them barely 20 years of age. As the smoke cleared, German prisoners were rounded up on the blood-soaked sands. A few miles away, a different story unfolded on Juno Beach, the Canadian sector. Their objective? The vital Carpiquet Airport. What could these young soldiers have been thinking, carried on a 5,000-mile journey from their homes, only to land at Bernières-sur-Mer, a small, unknown seaside resort that was about to become their entire world? They had no idea what awaited them. The only footage of that first wave of attack was captured not by a human hand, but by the cold, impartial eye of an automatic camera fixed to a landing craft. And yet, even this machine in its detachment, could not fail to record a gesture of simple, fleeting humanity amidst the carnage. Soon, the very first French house in Normandy would be liberated. It would cost the lives of men who had been asked not to film, but to fight. The focus shifted to the first German prisoners and to the raw anger of a proud Frenchman confronting the vanquished occupiers. But the German surrender did little to mask the ongoing difficulties. A rough, unforgiving sea now hampered the landing of the second assault wave. 300 young Canadians would lose their lives on that stretch of coast. Their sacrifice, however, was not in vain. With the beachhead established, their surviving brothers-in-arms began the slow, brutal advance inland toward the city of Caen. And here they met their first reward, the faces of young French women overcome with joy at seeing their country liberated by these men from a distant land, many of whom spoke their language, albeit with a funny accent. And yet, back at Allied headquarters in Portsmouth, a different mood prevailed. Despite British Admiral Ramsay's proud smile for the vital part played by his fleet, the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, remained silent. On his shoulders, he still bore the immense unspoken weight of all that was yet to come. Anxiety hung in the air. Since dawn, the messages had poured in, a frantic tide of paper and static. Some were alarming, speaking of the chaos on a beach codenamed Omaha. Others, from Utah or the British sectors, offered a fragile encouragement. But one look at the commander's face revealed the truth. The battle was balanced on a knife's edge. 6 hours after the first boat scraped the sand, they were still there, pinned at the foot of the bluffs at Omaha. Even in the maelstrom, an unprecedented medical corps moved with the first waves, a testament to a promise that every life would be fought for. They were there to offer immediate care to the wounded, a duty of compassion extended even to the enemy. Never had such aid been so desperately needed as on the crimson-stained shores of bloody Omaha, where the dead lay in rows beside a handful of exhausted prisoners. 3,000 Americans would not see the sunset. Their lives were lost on the most lethal of the 5 landing beaches. And yet, as the day bled into evening under a newly cleared sky, the tide began to turn. The first waves, against all odds, had clawed their way inland, carving out a foothold. More troops began to pour ashore. At last, it could be said that the landings were complete. But this was merely the end of the beginning. The battle for Normandy and for the soul of France had just begun. 2 days later, General Montgomery arrived. He had cause for concern. Unwilling to commit his armored divisions until the balance of power tilted decisively in his favor, he delayed. The city of Caen, a prize that was meant to be his on the first day, remained in enemy hands. His own troops, relieved to be ashore with relatively light losses, seemed to lack a certain ferocity. A strange, almost surreal interlude took hold. Cameras rolled, capturing the first encounters with French civilians asked to pose for the cause. On this day, June the 8th, a man named Norman Clegg, holding a simple clapperboard, filmed these moments of tentative freedom. 5 days later, Norman Clegg would be killed by German fire. In his footage and in his fate, compassion and morbidity are never far apart. But these images also reveal a slackening of pace, a brief exhale after the immense effort of the landings. It was a pause the Germans would exploit with ruthless efficiency. Though held back from the front by von Rundstedt's initial orders, the German reserves now reacted. The counterattack came on the 7th, 8th, and 9th of June. The formidable 12th Panzer Division, the Hitlerjugend, slammed into the Allied advance, barring the road to Caen for the British and Canadians. They dug in, establishing a formidable defensive ring outside the city. The bombing raids on Caen itself proved tragically ineffective against these entrenched positions. They did, however, provide the German propaganda machine with potent imagery, its own soldiers suffering the same fate as the city's inhabitants, all under a rain of Allied bombs. The German army maintained its grip. For the first refugees, the approach of their liberators was not a moment of celebration, but a signal to flee. Liberation, it seemed, would first require destruction. And for the people of Normandy, the war had only just begun. In the lethal chaos of the invasion, entire divisions of Allied paratroopers were adrift, scattered across the Norman countryside. Dropped with brutal imprecision, they were severed from their comrades, advancing inland from the sea. Many were captured, but few seemed resigned to their fate. The American airborne had paid a staggering price, losing over half their equipment and 1 in 5 of their men. A dear cost for the honor of being the first to tread on French soil. But their very dispersion, a tactical failure, became a strategic advantage. It sowed confusion among German defenders, creating the illusion of a far greater force, a phantom army descending from the skies. While the ghosts of the airborne haunted the hedgerows, their comrades paid a final, solemn tribute to the fallen of the 81st. On the ground, the war of attrition raged. On the 9th of June, Americans captured the small town of Isigny, only to face a furious German counterattack. The German defense of the town had been the critical barrier preventing Allied forces from Omaha Beach from linking up with those from Utah. But after relentless bombardment drove the Germans out for good, Isigny was taken. The Allied front was at last reunited, a continuous line of steel and men stretching over 60 miles from Ouistreham to the Cottontan Peninsula. Beyond the rubble, amidst the ruins of their homes, where did the inhabitants of Isigny now look? Perhaps farther off, towards the sea, where a French ship was finally crossing the channel. With the Allies firmly established along the coast, it was time to bring in General de Gaulle, leader of the Provisional French government. Charles de Gaulle had never liked being in need of help, and stepping onto French soil at Courcelles after 4 years of exile was no exception. The day before, Winston Churchill, ever distrustful, had written to Field Marshal Montgomery, "I must inflict on you a visit from General de Gaulle. I do not think you should greet him on the beach. It would be sufficient for him to arrive at your headquarters." De Gaulle would spend only 1 day in France. For him, too, time was pressing. He told Montgomery what the British Field Marshal wanted to hear, and in return was allowed to command the limelight. Monty even assigned his own cameraman, Norman Johnson, the task of following the general, perhaps to keep a watchful eye on him. Johnson, though used to his own leader's whims, saw the stow. In the maelstrom of liberation, amidst the collision of armies and the friction of allies, one tall figure strode through the ruins, an embodiment of a nation's pride, determined to be seen, impossible to ignore, casting a long shadow over the future he was here to reclaim. An inscrutable expression, a mask of resolve, yet his presence ignited a palpable hope. He moved as if the camera did not exist, a man already shouldering the weight of a nation reborn. In Bayeux, the first French town liberated, a wave of relief washed over the streets. Here, at last, were Frenchmen free from the German yoke, a profound symbol of renewed sovereignty. Charles de Gaulle made it a point of honor to walk among his own people, flanked by the men and women of the resistance. There were no British, no Americans in his procession. Reaching the town hall, he installed his own administration, a defiant act that served notice to the Allies. They would have no say in the political destiny of France. Power, he made clear, was already being reclaimed. While men could land on open beaches, an army could not be sustained by them. To fuel the great battle for France, a miracle of engineering was required, artificial ports rising from the sea itself. At Arromanches on the British front and Omaha for the Americans, a colossal artery began to pump life into the invasion. Each day between 150 and 200 ships would disgorge their cargo. 7,000 vehicles, 15,000 tons of supplies, and thousands upon thousands of men. But the Atlantic is a fickle master. A storm began to gather, a tempest of a ferocity not seen in Normandy for 40 years. Within the anchorages, ship ponds designed to tame the waves could not withstand the cataclysm. Some broke free, unleashing the full fury of the ocean into the heart of the harbor. Floating docks and gangways tore from their torm raged, severing the lifeline of supplies and reinforcements. When the skies finally cleared on the morning of June the 23rd, they revealed a scene of utter devastation. Hundreds of ships and shattered wrecks lay strewn along the coastline. While British engineers worked feverishly to resurrect the port at Arromanches, the American harbor at Omaha was a total loss. The Grand Allied plan was now 10 days behind schedule. The strategic calculus had changed overnight. The deep water port of Cherbourg was no longer an objective. It was an absolute necessity. Though surrounded, the city remained a German fortress. On June the 26th, American infantry pushed into the city's suburbs. That same day, before a throng of press he visibly disdained, the garrison's commandant, Lieutenant General von Schlieben, came to surrender. A giant of a man, he paused to politely wipe his feet before entering the presence of his victor, the young American General Collins. It was a small gesture of decorum in a moment of profound defeat. But in this act, he broke a sacred oath sworn to Hitler, to choose death over the shame of surrender. Von Schlieben would surrender even before his own men, who would not lay down their arms until the following day. There was little charity for the prisoners. Since the landings, the Americans alone had lost 22,000 men. In the faces of the captured, a story was told, some old, some barely boys. It was the face of an empire in decline, scraping the bottom of its reserves. For every fortress that fell, for every general who surrendered, the price was paid in the currency of youth, a debt that would haunt a generation. In the West, the German army was an aging force, a shadow of the legions now locked in a death struggle with the Red Army in the East. But even a shadow could cast a long and deadly pall. At Cherbourg, the illusion of German strength finally shattered. 36,000 men surrendered, a number so vast it defies the camera's lens. Yet the images that emerge mark us forever. With the port's fall, a critical section of the Atlantic wall had crumbled into dust. The faces of the enlisted men were masks of exhaustion and relief. But their officers held a different gaze, a rigid haughtiness. Or was it something else? The profound, corrosive shame of defeat. The news reached a furious furor. Hitler seized personal command of the Western Front, dismissing the veteran von Rundstedt for daring to suggest a truce. In his place came the more pliable Field Marshal von Kluge. Field Marshal Rommel, watching the Führer's descent into strategic madness, knew his own task had changed. It was no longer to win, but simply to delay the inevitable catastrophic end. Yet, across the lines, General Eisenhower was plagued by his own anxieties. Cherbourg was theirs, but the grand plan was stalling. Montgomery had failed to take Cannes, the city designated as the critical launch pad for the Allied breakout. The Germans, pushed inland, now held the advantage of space, of depth, of the possibility of reinforcement. The Allies remained perilously confined, a vast army hemmed in against the sea. For the Americans, there was only one path forward, to punch through the enemy front in the Cotentin Peninsula. But this was no open country for a war of movement. This was the bocage, a labyrinth of ancient hedgerows, earthen walls, and sunken lanes that turned the landscape into a fortress. Here, a defender could see without being seen. For the young GIs, utterly unprepared for this claustrophobic warfare, it was a waking nightmare. In this immense green checkerboard, a handful of determined men could halt an entire battalion. To take one field was a victory measured in yards, but the enemy would simply fall back to the next and the next. Tanks, forced onto narrow roads, became easy prey. When compelled to climb the hedgerow banks, they exposed their unarmored bellies to the waiting anti-tank guns. These traps of earth and foliage consumed thousands of American lives, a bloody failure to break through what the soldiers grimly called this goddamn country. With the Americans mired in the hedgerows, the imperative fell to the British. They had to take Caen. Montgomery, his timetable in tatters, finally resolved to unleash overwhelming force. He called upon the Royal Air Force. In a storm of high explosives, more than 2,500 tons of bombs rained down upon the ancient Norman city. After 2 days of ferocious combat, 115,000 British and Canadian troops fought their way into the eastern ruins. The city was three-quarters destroyed. On the 13th of July, Montgomery himself arrived. It had taken him more than a month to capture a piece of a city he had planned to secure on the first day. Amidst the rubble, the inhabitants raised the flag of the Cross of Lorraine, a symbol of liberation over a kingdom of ghosts. Victory had come, but it wore the face of annihilation, a stark reminder that the first casualty of war is not truth, but innocence. In the land, in the people, and in the very idea of a clean and noble triumph. The city of 1,000 steeples lay in ruins, yet the British propaganda machine painted a different picture, one of cheerful inhabitants toasting their liberators. The reality was far darker. A question, which echoes even today, began to form in the rubble. Was this devastation and the loss of 2,000 lives the necessary price for a city already encircled? In the skeletal remains of a Normandy church, a lone German soldier plays the organ, a surreal interlude in the symphony of destruction. Who was he? A madman? A monster? Or simply a man, a musician, weighed down by the excesses of his leaders, seeking a fleeting moment of grace amid the carnage? Days later, the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, arrived on Norman soil, demanding to see progress. But for all of Field Marshal Montgomery's confident tours, he could not conjure a victory. He was master of his command car, but not of the plains beyond the city, which remained firmly in German hands. 10 days after its capture, the British front had not moved. Churchill's impatience would change nothing. From his headquarters, Supreme Commander Eisenhower viewed the stalemate with mounting alarm. For the immense resources poured into the British sector, the result was a bitter failure. His gaze turned westward to the American sector and to the quiet, methodical three-star General Omar Bradley. The architect of the Omaha and Utah landings, Bradley was a man defined not by bluster, but by calm, clear-headed effectiveness. He believed the Americans could shatter the deadlock in the Cottonton Peninsula. He had a plan, its CA, designed to break the enemy's spine. To blast his men out of the hedgerow country, Bradley envisioned a new kind of warfare, a carpet of precision bombing to pulverize the German front line. Once the breach was made, his armies would pour through, driving for Brittany, the Seine, and the Loire. On the 25th of July, the sky itself became a weapon. Allied bombers unleashed a torrent of explosives upon a narrow corridor of land between Saint-Lô and Perrier. In the maelstrom, the elite Panzer-Lehr division, commanded by Rommel's trusted subordinate, was effectively erased from the map. The door had been kicked open. American troops surged through the gap, finally escaping the claustrophobic hell of the bocage. It was the breakout, the moment the entire campaign had been waiting for. The net hauled in thousands of German soldiers, many of them not hardened veterans, but the last dregs of a collapsing war machine. The Norman landscape, a verdant trap for weeks, was now being tamed by brutal ingenuity. Tanks, newly fitted with immense steel blades, tore through the ancient hedgerows, transforming the very earth into an instrument of war. Before July was over, the war of attrition had ended. The war of movement had begun. A single, violent rupture had changed everything, proving that in the calculus of total war, victory is not always measured in ground taken, but in the precise, terrible moment, a stalemate is broken. The Allied advance had reached Coutances, Avranches, and Granville, the last port in Normandy before the Breton coast. And then, in early August, a new army landed upon the sands of Utah Beach. For years, these men had been without a country, leaving everything behind to fight the Germans and Italians in the desolate landscapes of North Africa. Now, the soldiers of the 2nd French Armored Division had come home. They were no longer exiles, but victors, ready to reclaim their beloved soil. At their head stood General Leclerc, a man as lean and unbending as the cane he carried. An aristocrat by birth, he possessed every attribute that might have aligned him with a collaborationist Vichy regime. Yet, as early as June 1940, he had chosen a different path, the path of de Gaulle, the path of honor. Now, he was landing as his homeland's liberator. His division was integrated into the American Third Army, poised at last to fight on French ground. At General Bradley's headquarters, the American filmmaker, George Stevens, captures a moment of ceremony. Field Marshal Montgomery, ever aware of the camera's gaze, decorates a handful of American soldiers, a duty at which he excelled. Under pressure from Eisenhower, the British commander had finally ceded control of the final battle to the Americans. For its successful outcome, Bradley was counting on another general entirely, a man who wore a Colt .45 in his holster and impatience in his heart, George Patton. As dawn broke, the Germans played their final card. From the plain of Caen, they launched a desperate counteroffensive on Mortain, a furious lunge intended to drive the Allies back into the sea. The attack, planned by Hitler himself, was doomed from the start. It was broken not by men, but by the devastating rockets of Allied Typhoon fighter bombers. It had no chance of success. Field Marshal von Kluge would write, shortly before taking his own life, it would be the last German offensive in the West. Worse still for the Wehrmacht, their desperate attack was precisely what Bradley had been waiting for. He had willfully allowed the enemy to push deep into the Allied flank. Now, they were ensnared, trapped by the Americans to the south and the British and Canadians to the north. The moment had come for the maneuver Bradley had long envisioned, a vast pincer movement to catch the enemy between the British advancing from Caen and the American armies surging from the south, sealing them in a pocket between the towns of Argenton and Falaise. As the German attack at Mortain faltered, Patton's divisions thundered toward Le Mans on the road to Paris. But then, some of them peeled away, turning north towards Argenton in a great sweeping arc that began to encircle the German 7th Army. To the north, the Anglo-Canadians hammered down, forming the anvil to Patton's hammer. The German army was not defeated, it was annihilated. Eisenhower would later call the battlefield the biggest bloodbath the war had ever known, adding that only the poet Dante could have been capable of describing it. For hundreds upon hundreds of yards, without interruption, one stepped only on dead and rotting flesh. Here, in the fields of Normandy, victory had a face, and it was indistinguishable from hell. The battle was won, but the silence that fell over the Falaise pocket was a testament to a cost that could never truly be counted. The final toll was staggering. Between 5,000 and 6,000 German soldiers were killed. In the hollow eyes of those who surrendered, the truth of the collapse was undeniable. It would take days to process the columns of the captured some 30,000 to 40,000 men shuffling out of the Falaise cauldron. For them, captivity was not defeat, but a victory of life over death. The Wehrmacht had conscripted men from across its occupied territories. Not all were prepared to die for the Third Reich. And here, in the fields of Normandy, their war was over. With the German army in the west decisively broken, the Allied front surged forward. Patton's armies crossed the Seine and the Loire, reaching the geographical limits set by the planners of Operation Overlord. The Supreme Commander, Dwight Eisenhower, now looked to the next phase, the great push towards Germany itself. But one city stood in the way, not just as a military objective, but as a symbol. On the 19th of August, a blanket of smoke hung over Paris. Stirred by news of the Allied advance, the city had begun to rise against its occupiers. Yet it was the German command itself that had decided to abandon the French capital. Seen from above, an endless procession of convoys snaked east, caring little for the makeshift barricades thrown in their path. The footage is indelible. 5 German soldiers engulfed in flames. It is a moment that detracts nothing from the courage of the men and women who fought the retreating army, dozens of whom paid the ultimate price before a single Allied soldier arrived. The next day, General de Gaulle appeared at Eisenhower's headquarters. The American commander was a pragmatist. He wished to avoid a destructive street-by-street battle for Paris, preferring to encircle the capital, cut it off. But the imperious French leader argued passionately, not only to prevent a potential bloodbath, but to forestall a power vacuum that could be filled by communist elements of the resistance. Eisenhower yielded. General Bradley was ordered to detach Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division, already renowned for its actions at Falaise. It would be a French unit that would have the honor of entering Paris and accepting the German surrender. After fierce fighting south of the capital, the skies over the suburbs seemed to turn blue. The wind carried red banners, and men in white shirts lined the streets, creating a tricolor world to welcome Leclerc's soldiers to the gates of the city. And then, jubilation. The desperate gamble of the man who had broadcast his defiant appeal on the 18th of June 1940 had paid off. The miracle had happened. France, once crushed, occupied, and humiliated, was now taking its place shoulder to shoulder with the victors. The victory parade down the Champs-Élysées would cement the legend. But that is a story written for the nation. Our story ends the following day on a less magical Place de la Concorde. There stood the head of a country whose political future was still a fragile, uncertain thing. A man who had won the liberation, but now had to face the far more complex task of building a peace. Before the people of France, de Gaulle sought the endorsement of the Supreme Allied Commander. Eisenhower, ever the pragmatist, readily consented, as did General Bradley. Yet it was a calculated modesty that saw the Americans recede into the wings, allowing de Gaulle alone to occupy the center of the stage. Eisenhower's objective was a symbolic march of his troops through the liberated capital, a powerful statement that the fight against the Third Reich was far from over. With an astute and forward-looking calculus, the Americans understood the shape of the world to come. They saw the looming specter of a divided continent and knew that in the uncharted post-war era, the allegiance of a restored France would be indispensable. The tapestry of this history is woven from threads of stark monochrome and sudden vivid color, but whether in grayscale or in the hues of life, every frame bears witness to the same profound truth. The fate of innumerable men who crossed the sea to Normandy, so many of them rendered anonymous by the sheer scale of the endeavor, A face turns in the crowd, a momentary glance captured by the lens, then lost to the current of history. A soldier, turning for an instant, becomes an eternal question. We can never know their names, yet we live in the world they fought to build, their silent, fleeting presence a permanent testament to the cost of freedom.